Welcome to our presentation today, Applying to Grad School in Switzerland, brought to you by Kaffi. Just a quick info about the webinar. So it will be around 35-40 minutes. The webinar will be recorded and then the video will be uploaded to the Kaffi YouTube channel. Relevant resources we will discuss today, they will all be posted on our Kaffi website under the advising section. And the webinar will be mostly in English, but Arabic is welcome. We will have questions in the end, and the questions will not be posted on YouTube. So if you're not comfortable with that. A little bit about me. So first, I'm Hussein. I'm a Kaffi member. I've been around Switzerland for a while. I got my bachelor's in computer engineering at UB. Then I moved to Switzerland for my master's. I also tried the PhD, but didn't finish that. I stayed for like 2 years, and then I did, and now I'm a computer engineer in Zurich in Switzerland. All in all, I've been around for 8 years. So today, what we'll talk about is grad school in Switzerland. So the outline will be, we'll first introduce Switzerland. We will introduce the university systems, and then we will discuss university application, financing, the visa application, finally managing your stay in Switzerland. Okay. Now, let's introduce Switzerland a bit so that we have a better background of the country we're talking about. Right? First thing we will notice when we mention Switzerland, it is how beautiful it is. Everybody will say, oh, Switzerland is very beautiful. And this is actually true. Switzerland, one of the most beautiful countries around. And it is really worth just studying there to get to visit it and enjoy. Now, what's the capital of Switzerland? This is more of a tricky question. It's not Zurich, even though Zurich is the biggest city in Switzerland. It's not Geneva, which is probably the most famous city in Switzerland. And for you intellectuals out there, it's also not Bern, even though it's the unofficial capital. In fact, Switzerland doesn't have any capital. And the reason is Switzerland is a federation. So it has a federal government and it is compounded of 26 cantons. Each canton has a sovereign rule and each canton is separately managed and ruled. And the government and the federal government kind of unites all of these cantons. And then each canton on its own, it's also divided to small communes. And then the communes are managing something like cities or towns or villages. So it's kind of yet another level of, yet another federal level of governance. Now, the official name of Switzerland is Confederatio Helvetica, and that's the Latin name. This will come in handy later. So one thing about Switzerland, and it's also not very well known, is Switzerland is not part of the EU. And even though they have trade agreements with the EU, they have the movement agreements, so people can, so EU nationals and Swiss nationals can easily move across and work. And there's also the Schengen agreement. So people with Swiss visa or Swiss permit, they can also travel or across EU or Schengen zone, but they are not officially part of the EU. And this also means that Switzerland does not use the euro as a currency. In fact, in Switzerland, they have their own currency, which is the Swiss francs. And the actual name is, or the shortening is CHF, which stands for Confederatio Helvetica Francs. Right? And this is, again, it's a Latin name. And the reason why they use the Latin name is, in Switzerland, they have 4 different languages. So 4 languages are the official language. We have German, French, Italian, and Romansh. And Romansh is not Romanian. It is actually a dialect of the Latin language that was used back in the day. And it has a very small presence in Switzerland. However, because we have some cantons that only use Romansh, then it became also an official language. And this kind of reflects how different cantons are united to form Switzerland. Now, which language does the city speak? It really depends. So in Zurich, we have German. In Geneva, we have French. And then in the city of Fribourg, we actually have both languages spoken. Now, all of them are official, but then in a city, it really depends. So not all language. So if you're in Zurich, don't expect to hear any French. Finally, Switzerland is actually very expensive. In 2020, it ranked as the most expensive country in the world. However, Switzerland have very great opportunities when it comes to education. So that's why we're here today. We want to give you a better idea of the opportunities we have in Switzerland and their costs. This will help you make an informed decision about your future. Okay. So next thing we'll talk about is Swiss university system. In Switzerland, the higher education starts with a bachelor program. This is usually 3 years program, and then it is followed by a master program. The master program can range something between 1 to 2 or 3 years. Usually it's complemented with an internship or an apprenticeship. Usually the master program is considered a complementary or an extension of the bachelor program. So you rarely see anybody doing only the bachelor program in Switzerland. However, given the level of education in Switzerland, the master program usually offers a value for holders of a bachelor's or even master's students. Now, you can also continue your education program as a PhD. And usually in a PhD, it's research-oriented. And Switzerland spends a lot of resources on PhD programs and on education in general. Usually a PhD is considered a full-time job, and it's usually covered, like it's usually paid, so you have full expenses covered. So in this presentation, we will focus mostly on masters and PhD, more particularly on masters. And PhD is usually very similar in terms of the process and resources that we will talk about today. When there are differences between the two, I will make sure that I will highlight. So let's talk about universities in Switzerland. The most important or the most prominent universities are the Federal Institutes of Technology. And we have in Switzerland, there are two. There's EPFL and ETH Zurich. So both of them are Federal Institutes of Technology. It means they are not managed by the canton. They are actually managed and funded by the federal government. And they are top universities in Switzerland and in the world. These universities usually attract top students from across the world, but also top professors and researchers. So these programs are very highly rated. They mostly provide programs in engineering and applied sciences, and most of their master's and PhD programs are in English. It's very rare to find a program that is not in English. And this is, again, because they want to attract talent from across the world. So if you are an engineering student, these are the universities you want to look to apply to. It is very challenging to get there, so keep that in mind. However, getting there, like, you will be in top 20 universities in the world, so the education you will get will be very highly rewarded, and it is very well known all over the world. So not only in Europe, even in the US, these universities are highly regarded. Now, the next set of universities we have in Switzerland are cantonal universities. So these are the more standard universities. They are based in Swiss cantons and funded by the Swiss cantons. There are 10 in Switzerland, and they usually provide programs in art sciences and applied sciences. You rarely find any engineering programs there because they are mostly located in federal institutes. Most of the master's and PhD programs are in English. However, some of them are also in regional languages. So, for example, in the University of Zurich, you might have some programs in German, or in Geneva or Lausanne. You might also have programs that are in French. So if you're familiar with the language, this might also be an opportunity for you. If you're not and you prefer English, then depending on the program, you can also find something for you. One thing to note is in these universities, the level really vary because, as I said, they are independent universities and they are managed by cantons. So it really depends on the university whether the program is really outstanding or kind of mediocre. So if you're not applying to the federal institutes and you want one of these universities, make sure you do your research about the program you're applying to before you just say, oh, this is a Swiss university. Finally, we have universities of applied sciences. These are also government institutes, and they are based in Swiss cantons and regions, very similar to the cantonal universities. However, the main difference is they are focused on job market. So the University of Applied Sciences were founded something around 1990, so they are rather modern. And their aim is to offer apprenticeship in the industry along with your education, so that when you graduate, you are ready to move to the Swiss market. However, since they are rather recent, they are not very well known in Europe and in the world. So you might be limited when you're applying there to Swiss market. It might also be maybe in Europe or in Germany, like neighboring countries, Germany, France, Italy, or Austria, they are more familiar with the system, but it is not very well regarded. It's not highly regarded all over the world, or it's not very well known. However, it's still a master's or a PhD program. They offer programs in applied sciences, sciences and arts. However, it might be a little bit tricky to find programs in English. Some do, but they are mostly in regional languages. And again, the fact is it's very tied to the industry in Switzerland. Now, if you're looking to move to Switzerland in long term, it is a good idea to consider them, but then also consider the limitations that come along getting your degree from there. They offer both master's and PhD, and again, the PhD, even though it is a research-oriented PhD, they usually focus on applied research, so that again, it can transition easily to the job market. All the universities I've mentioned so far are public universities. However, there are also a lot of private universities in Switzerland. And the various private schools, they have different domains. So you have business schools, you have engineering schools and whatnot. However, you have to keep in mind that these are private universities. So they have the Swiss price. It's not subsidized by the government. All the public universities I mentioned before, they are subsidized. So when it comes to your tuition, it is very feasible to pay it. So the tuition would range something around $500 a month, kind of. $500 a semester. But I will talk later about that. The other thing that you want to keep in mind when applying to these private universities is quality also varies. Because the educational system in Switzerland is very deep, there are different valid degrees that private universities can apply. So even though we have these high caliber schools, sometimes you might also come across diploma mills or paid to graduate schools. And these are things that you want to avoid, where you would be wasting your money. Even though it's Switzerland, because of the state of the education system, you can still find such schools. So yeah, when applying to private universities, be very careful whether it is from tuition point of view or from the type of degree you would get. So now let's say you looked at the available universities and you selected the program. Now you want to apply. So let's talk a little bit about university applications. In general, the application requirements are very standard to everywhere else. So you will definitely need your CV, your statement of purpose. You will need your degrees and transcripts from previous bachelor or master's degrees, and you will need recommendation letters from professors that you worked with. It can also be a recommendation letter from previous job you did or previous internship you did. Now, these would be usually in the program language. So if you're applying to a program in French or German, you might want to provide these in French or German. But then again, if you apply to English, then it will be in English. Additional conditional requirements that can occur. The first is the language requirement. So some universities explicitly ask for a language requirement, whether it's in English, German, Italian, or French. However, this is not always the case. So, for example, University of Geneva, they offer programs in French and English, but they say it's up to the student to be ready to it's up to the student to have the proper language requirement before joining, and we would not check. So this is something you want to keep in mind. Usually, if you're from a university that offers the program in English, then it can also waiver the language requirement if the program is in English. Same thing with French. Yeah, but you have to be careful. It really depends on the program you're applying. Another thing is these special examinations, mostly like GRE, TOEFL, blah. These are things that they are not usually asked for in Switzerland. It's very rare to see somebody asking for GRE. But then sometimes they say if you submit them, it will also be considered in your application. So again, this is something very conditional, depends on the program. You want to see if the program asks for it or not. And then if it does, then you have to make sure that you apply for the exam early enough, because these exams usually don't occur, they occur in a regular period, but not very frequently. And then the result might take time, and you have to send the results to the university by mail and whatnot. So you have to be careful when dealing with these special examinations. Finally, the fees for the applications. In master and PhD program, you should not be surprised if the application is for free. So you can just apply without paying anything. And this is usually because Swiss universities want to encourage people to apply. And this is, again, part of the educational system in Switzerland, where they want to encourage foreign students to join. So yeah, in some places, fees are not required. And yeah, the application is for free. But again, this doesn't apply to all universities. So sometimes you might have to pay a fee. And usually it is in Swiss francs, which is almost one-to-one equivalent to the euro or the dollar. So there's almost one-to-one mapping. Now, beside that, the application dates. There is the standard application for the fall semester, so the start of the academic year. The range is rather large, so applications might start from, the deadlines might be as early as December or as late as April. And the reason is that for federal institutes, for example, for ETH and EPFL, because they are competing with US schools and other European schools, they have the deadline rather early. So the deadline is in mid-December. Other universities, they have it something around February is a common date, but it cannot be generalized. Sometimes it can go as late as mid-April. The other thing is, most universities also have multiple deadlines. So EPFL has multiple deadlines for the same fall semester. So they have one deadline that closes in December, and then another deadline that closes in April. ETH have that as well. However, the second deadline is not for foreign students. So sometimes you have multiple deadlines. The first deadline is, the earlier deadline is for international students, and the later deadline is for local students. So make sure that you look this early enough. So if you're applying for next year, then make sure you check now the program you want to apply to, so that you know ahead of time. As for spring semester, it's not very common in Switzerland, but it might be possible. Some universities have it, but most don't. So I wouldn't count on it. But again, depends on the program. Usually for the summer semester, for the spring semester, the application deadline is in summer. So it would be something around June or August, or at latest, it would be something like September. Finally, for PhD positions, usually they share the same deadlines as the master program. However, since I said that the PhD position is usually a full-time job, some positions are usually open all year long. So you can, there wouldn't be like an application, but more like you're applying something similar to a job. And then there it would be open whenever a professor is willing to hire. This is not common for federal institutes, but this is more common with cantonal universities, so University of Bern, Geneva, and others. Next, now you know the date, you already applied. Now you're worried about financing your studies. You want to make sure that you can actually afford going to Switzerland. As I said earlier, Switzerland is rather expensive. So here I try to give you a little bit more in numbers. The monthly expenses usually range from something like 1.2K francs to 2K. And the reason why this variation is mostly about the rent. So as I mentioned earlier, tuition is something around 500 to 1,000 francs a semester. Mostly it's around like the 500 range, but it can be something a little bit higher. Depends on the program. For both ETH and EPFL, it is more around like 500 a semester. Now for rent, it really varies. So for the big cities like Geneva, Switzerland, and Geneva, Lausanne, and Zurich, where the major universities are based, and there are a lot of companies there, then the rent is rather on the higher end, and it can be something around as cheap as 750 and as expensive as 1.2K. We will talk more about housing later, but yeah, the range can be rather large, and it can be the major part of your expenses. Now, if you go to other cities, other smaller cities like University of Bern, Fribourg, then the rent might be even less. But this is, I mean, it really depends. But I wouldn't go like, don't expect it to be as low as in France or in Italy, where rent is much more cheap. For living expenses, it would range around 300 to 600 francs. If you're really frugal and then you like cook all your meals and prepare everything ahead of time, you can get by 300 francs. However, if you prefer to not cook and like buy food from the university, which is subsidized, you might end up paying 600 francs a month for food. But yeah, this depends on your lifestyle and how you want to manage it. If you can always manage with 300 francs by cooking decent meals. However, eating outside in Switzerland is rather expensive. Finally, there is like mandatory student insurance, medical insurance that would go something around 75 to 100 francs. There's transportation. Usually, Switzerland is very famous for the good public transportation, so you need like a student public transportation pass. It's usually around 50 francs, but then it varies from city to city or from canton to canton. And finally, there is the student tax. So if you're there and you're not working, you still have to pay tax as a student, and it ranges from 30 to 50 francs, depending on the city. So yeah, again, depending on your rent, your expenses might be as low as 1 or 1.2K francs, or all the way up to 2K. Later, I will mention the rent options or the housing options and how you can make sure you get something, or how you can try to get something towards the lower end. Next, we have funding. So usually if you're doing a PhD, it's a full-time employment, so you get a salary. The salaries in Switzerland starts from something around 3,000 francs, and this would cover all your expenses. Compared to the previous slide, it would cover all your expenses. However, keep in mind that in Switzerland, getting paid 3K francs is something towards the lower end. So you won't get like workers would get double or triple this salary. So this is like an entry-level salary in Switzerland, and this kind of reflects to you how expensive it is. PhD students, if they are like using their full salary, probably they have some opportunity to save, but not too much. yeah, I mean, it might be tempting to say, okay, I will just go for a PhD after I finish my basic education, my bachelor's. But PhD is tricky, and it is very research oriented, and it's not for everybody. If you want to learn more about considering PhD as your future option, I would recommend that you guys look at the US webinar that we did a few months ago. And there, the presenters discuss the opportunity about PhD, if it is right or wrong for you, and what to consider when applying for PhD programs. Now, for master programs, one thing that is rather common in Swiss universities are excellence scholarships and research scholarships. So excellence scholarships are based on merit. So if you're an overachieving student, then you're eligible to apply for excellence scholarship. And research scholarships, they are more like part-time jobs. So you would work with a research lab while you're studying. Now, both of them would cover around 2,000 francs a month. So they would cover almost all your expenses, so you don't have to do something extra. But for these programs, you have to apply when you start your application. So usually, for example, with EPFL, when you apply your program, there is along with the application, you say, I want to be considered for the excellence scholarship and the research scholar positions. And then based on your profile, they either grant it to you or not. In other universities, it might be different, but most of the time it happens along with the application. So make sure when you're applying to the university, look into these kind of programs and try to apply to them where possible. Next, the other option to fund your education is by work. In Switzerland, by law, students are allowed to work, and they can do up to 15 hours per week during a semester. And they can do full-time job during holidays. So when there is no school, like in Christmas or over summer, you can do full-time jobs. Now, the only restriction is you can only start working after you spend 6 months in Switzerland. So usually this is after you spend your first semester and your first winter break. The other thing you want to consider, so with 15 hours per week, you would be covering something around 1.5 to 2K. It might cover all your expenses, but there's no guarantee. And then also you cannot really rely on finding a job before you arrive because you're not allowed to. So it's a little bit tricky. But yeah, once you're there, if you can make sure that you cover the expenses of your first semester, then you can try to find job before the first semester ends. Usually universities offer work opportunities, so you can work as a TA in a university, but you can also find opportunities outside. And usually universities have work portals. So if somebody's offering a job, then they can post for the university so that the students can see. Finally, scholarships. There are a lot of scholarships offered, but they are usually very specific to either a major or a certain program, or they are only offered for students from a certain country. We don't cover any of them in this webinar. However, one useful resource is this link from the University of EPFL, where they list many scholarships that students can apply to. So yeah, I mean, you can spend some time to see if any of them apply to you, and then apply to them along with your application to get your education covered. Next topic is, now you decide that you want to move to Switzerland, you have an idea how you want to cover your finances, now you want to apply for the visa. So usually you can only apply for the visa once you get your acceptance letter, and you want to apply for the national visa, to the Swiss national visa. It's a visa type D, and you apply to it in the Swiss embassy. So for visitors or for tourism, usually Switzerland, it goes through TLS visa services. But for students, it's not the case. You actually have to go to the embassy. It's in Beirut. Usually, you want to apply 3 months in advance, so 3 months before your start of the semester. And processing might take the full 3 months. So you should try to apply as early as possible. So even before the 3 months period, as soon as you get your acceptance letter. One thing to note is that the embassy has no control of the process. So it's mostly done at the cantonal level. So if your visa is taking a bit too long, then it doesn't really help to talk to the embassy. But what you would rather do is check where your university is and try to find the cantonal office responsible for visas and then address them instead. In most cases, the university will be able to help you get more information about your visa process. So always check the university out. As for the requirements of the visa, there's the visa application online that you need to print out and fill. And then they would need your CV and motivation letter. This is very similar to what you submit to your university. However, make sure that you mention that you will leave Switzerland at the end of the studies. This is more for a legal reason, so that if you stay there and then you don't find a job, then there's a legal obligation that you leave the country. So yeah, as I said, you also need your acceptance letter. And one thing is you want your translated family registry. So in Arabic, this is إخراج العائلة. You want to translate it. I think English is fine, but it's better that you translate it to the regional language of the city you're applying to. And finally, there is no fees for student visas. So again, this is also for free. And this is also to encourage students to apply to Switzerland. Now, one last requirement is proof of financial security. So when you want to apply to the university or for the visa, the embassy will require you that you are able to cover yourself financially. So there are multiple options. So the first one is if you're just applying from Lebanon with like Lebanese parents, whatever, then you can apply a bank statement. And the bank statement has to show the last 6 months. Now, it can be your own bank or it can be your parents' bank. It depends who's sponsoring your visa, whether it's you or your parents or other family members. Now, the Swiss embassy wouldn't give any information about what's the requirements of the bank statement. So they would say it really depends. So even you can apply with like the standard Lebanese bank statement in liras. But we wouldn't recommend this. Most of the time, like especially now with the situation, it's better to have a dollar account, a fresh dollar account. But this doesn't mean that you cannot apply if you don't have a fresh dollar account. You can always try if you're, I mean, this is really dependent on the Swiss embassy and they don't give any information on that. I mean, if we find out more information after this webinar, we will upload it to the website. So before your visa application, it might be worth checking the website out. But for now, we can't give more information. The other option would be if you know somebody Swiss who's willing to sponsor you. So now, along with the bank statement for them, they would also need to give a letter explaining the situation of why they want to sponsor you. And finally, if you are like a PhD student or you got one of the scholarships, then your funding is kind of covered. So you can also use that as a proof of financial security. And I mean, you can apply a bank statement or not, but if the scholarship and the funding is covering your expenses, then you're good to go. Next, and finally, it's about managing your stay in Switzerland. So here it's like maybe 2 topics. The first topic is accommodation. As I said, housing might be rather expensive. So the cheapest options are usually student lodging or student housing. In Switzerland, it can be either managed by university or by a private institution. But it doesn't really depend. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the applications of the housing starts early, and there is very high demand for the student housing. So make sure that when you apply, check the university website. They will probably have a housing section, and then there they will indicate what institution is managing their student lodging. So at EPFL, for example, there is a private institution that is subsidized that managed the student housing. In Zurich, it's managed directly. In University of Zurich and at ETH, it's managed directly by university. So it depends. Yeah, but the application starts early, and the deadline might actually close on the same day. So make sure that when you apply, you know this deadline day, and then make sure you apply as soon as possible. Now, if you were not lucky enough to be able to get a student lodging, there are other options. One is temporary housing. Some might be offered by universities where they say, okay, there are students who couldn't find a place to stay and they are coming from abroad. Then they might offer some temporary housing. It might be a little bit more expensive than other housing, but then it is necessary if you want to, it is necessary for your for starting your education. Now, the other thing is, one other option for temporary housing is subletting from other students. So sometimes there are students who have a housing and then they are moving for like a semester abroad, or they have an internship, or they're moving to a different city for a while. Then you can actually rent the student housing from them. In this case, the best place to look at is either the university website. Under housing, they might have forums for people to post ads, or you can also check Facebook groups. With Facebook groups, it can be tricky because of the trust issues, especially if you're living abroad. You cannot really go and check the website. You cannot check the housing yourself, but it might be a good idea to look there if you're running out of options. Now, of course, you can search for a house in the market where Swiss non-students look for housing. Now, two things to keep in mind. This is one, they might be more expensive. Two is usually in Switzerland, it requires in-person visits. So if you don't visit in person, there's a low chance that you will get the house. Now, I'm not discouraging people, like if you couldn't find the student housing or temporary housing, feel free to apply for housing on the market. However, there is a lower probability. So I would suggest that you at least keep it as a last option. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is your residency permit. So when you first arrive to Switzerland, you will have, as I said, you will have a visa. And this visa is called an entry visa. Now, to be able to stay in Switzerland, you have to get a permit. And then the permit you renew every year. So there are two steps to get your permit. The first is when you first arrive, you want to register in the residence registration office. This is usually communal based, it's not cantonal based. And it depends where you live. It's not where your university is. So if let's say you're in Zurich, but you're living in a town outside Zurich, then you want to go to the commune of the town you're living in. It usually requires a rental contract so that they verify that you're living in whatever address you have. Temporary housing usually works. So if you have a temporary housing, you can use whatever temporary contract you have. And then once you move to something permanent, you have to go again to this registration office and inform them that you moved. This has to be done at the first 2 weeks of your arrival. And usually the registration would give you like a temporary ID. It will give you a registration document, and you can use that to do like the basic things on your arrival, like opening a bank account and opening a mobile number. Usually you would need a residency permit to do that. But once you register in this registration office, then you can have a temporary ID that you can use. Now, the second step would be getting your permit. So once you apply, once you register in the registration office, all you have to do is you wait for the invitation from the population office. The population office is cantonal based. So yeah, this is most probably is where your university is. In the cantonal office, in the population office, you would give your biometric data. So usually it is fingerprints in the picture. And then once you register your biometric data, you expect to get your permit sent to you by post. Now, the first permit, especially for master's students, it can take a few months to be issued, and it can take more than 3 months. So one good tip here is if you want to, let's say you finished your first semester, it takes about 4 months, and then you're waiting for your finals, but you want to go back home. One thing you can do is, and you still don't have your permit, one thing you can do is you can get a return visa. A return visa allows you to go out of Switzerland and come back. Yeah, because the entry visa will no longer be valid. Usually a permit would allow you to go back in, but if you don't have your permit, you need a return visa. But if you wait for more than 3 months for the invitation from the population office and you don't get your permit, then you're actually allowed, you're entitled for a free return visa. So you can travel outside Switzerland and come back without any issues. That's all for today. Thanks for joining me. And now I'd be happy to take questions.